Russia says it will abide by a ceasefire deal agreed on Thursday. U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice was in Tbilisi on Friday with Georgian President Saakashvili as he signed the agreement. Rice called the visit productive, even as Saakashvili denounced Moscow, saying Georgia will never surrender its freedom or any part of its territory. Despite movement on the diplomatic front, Georgia says Russian tanks are still advancing. As Rice spoke in Tbilisi, an army convoy was positioned no more than 40 kilometers away. The U.S. military is preparing to send more humanitarian aid to Georgia. In the strategic town of Gori, air supplies are slowly arriving and civilians are being let out to reach hospitals. Al Jazeera's Jonah Hull has more from Tbilisi.
3 hours late, and Condoleezza Rice emerged with President Saakashvili, and the news Georgia had accepted the terms of a ceasefire plan.
With the signature of the Georgian president on this ceasefire accord, all Russian troops and any irregular and paramilitary forces that entered with them must leave immediately.
If he was pleased at word the Russians were preparing to sign up as well, Mikhail Saakashvili didn't show it. This was another opportunity for grimly worded warnings and a statement of ultimate defiance.
Never ever we will give our freedom and independence. Never ever will give any piece of our territory. And freedom will go to every part of Georgia, to every ethnic group, to every community in Georgia, and we'll definitely get rid of these invaders.
The deal on the table here would establish a ceasefire, withdrawal of forces, and put international monitors on the ground. Clearly, resolving the territorial dispute over South Ossetia and Abkhazia will be much harder.
Now, for more on Washington's handling of the Russia-Georgia war, I'm joined by Professor Susan Allen Nan from the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. Professor Nan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
How would you rate the United States' response to this conflict? Was it perhaps a bit too pro forma? You know, we heard the threats and then the talk about freedom-loving nations and their protection, etc.
Well, I think it's understandable that in times of conflict and as conflicts are escalating, people act out of fear. And I think we've seen that from all the parties acting in this conflict now. We've seen the Russian fear of they need to protect against genocide in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. We've seen also the Americans wanting to protect Georgia from what appeared to be an invasion. And it's been unfortunate that the rhetoric has escalated to the extent that symbolic gestures that could have been timed differently, such as the missile defense shield agreement that's been signed with Poland. The timing of that's unfortunate. We need to think about how it looks to the Russians. And I think that
but did the
tensions have escalated in an unfortunate way.
Yeah, but did the Americans act out of fear?
I think that for too long the Americans had a policy of what seemed like unconditional support for Saakashvili. And when we have friends who are making statements that Saakashvili spoke of possibly taking South Ossetia and Abkhazia by force, and there was not strong words for Georgia at that time. I think that the United States had too long had a policy that seemed like unconditional support for Saakashvili, and then the United States has turned to denouncing Russia's actions in a way that is not constructive and acknowledging there may be some possible pieces of the motivation of Russia's actions that are in fact protecting the Abkhaz and the South Ossetians.
Well, let me put this to you another way. Would the United States have sacrificed its relationship with Moscow for Georgia?
I think that what's happened now is we've seen the relationship between Moscow and Washington has really deteriorated very quickly over this, and I don't think Washington meant for that to happen.
And we have a few seconds left, and I want to ask you this. Has this conflict demonstrated the limits of American power?
I think it's demonstrated the limits of this approach to American power in the region, and I think a more constructive approach, which would have much more influence, would be to look at the needs and interests of the people on the ground there, acknowledging not only the Georgian interests, but also the South Ossetian and the Abkhaz interests, and take a role of helping all of those people find ways to work through that meets everyone's needs to everyone's satisfaction.
Professor Susan Allen Nan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.